So if you just introduced me, I was talking to Tina. Sorry, do apologize. Can I, first of all, say what a pleasure it is to be here. It's not just the weather, not just Galway, but it's lovely to have this chance to do a book launch with Christine and with the president. What a nice guy, the president. Now, really, it's you know, there's so much fake news, bad news, grimness in the world at the moment. To have somebody of clearly his quality and standard in an important post like this it's very reassuring, is it not? So, thank you, Christine, for making this happen. Thank you also for all the effort and work you've put into the book, as well as I. We should both be up here, really. But I guess that doesn't work terribly well, so I will take on the role. It's not the first time I've spoken in this room, what I think is a beautiful room. And when I spoke at it last, I felt, you know, what words of wisdom have been uttered here over the centuries, and it's really quite daunting to speak in it, but wonderful. And we're here to celebrate this third edition, but actually there's another edition as well that has happened since I came here last, and that is this edition, which is my grandchild, my Irish grandchild, I should say. So my son has had the good sense to fall in love with an Irish woman, and Robin is starting on the path in life. As you can see, my son is training her well. But in all seriousness, it's having a grandchild. I don't know anybody else is old enough here to have a grandchild, but having a grandchild does give one pause about the nature of the world. It does make one think about what we are doing and why we are doing it, and what indeed Robin will be saying when she reaches my age. What will the world be like then? What will have happened by then? And it does give you some wonderful moments, but it also gives you some very reflective moments, because we are indeed, in the Chinese language, living in interesting times. Times where inequalities are so great that Danny Dorling now argues that Britain is as divided as it was when Charles Dickens wrote Hard Times. Massive accumulation of wealth in the hands of a very small number of people, very small number of men indeed, which is interesting in its own right. The populism, the post-truth, the fake news we've talked about, social media, Cambridge Analytica. It feels very much like the William Butler Yeats line has come to life, written in 1920. It could have been written now. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Could that not be a modern world? Think of the self-harm that is going on. We in public health sit on this data, and it's in some ways it's terrifying data. That, you know, WHO reckons in the European region, 88% of us are dying because of our own behaviour, or self-inflicted. And then, of course, we have to balance that with the corporate power, which means that the Coca-Colas and the McDonald's of this world have enormous influence, an influence that is only growing in the digital era. And sitting in the midst of all that, of course, is anthropomorphic climate change. So massive, massive changes. And the arrival of Robin, the work on the new textbook, really left me asking the question, how can social and critical marketing help us to cope in this very troubled world? What the people like Sartre and Camus called an absurd world. It does feel a bit absurd at times, does it not? And I'm thinking now about what we can bring to that party, the power of commercial marketing, perhaps, without its natural tendency, as Alan so evocatively explained it, towards manipulation, the compassion to intervene without the tendency sometimes to be patronizing, to be we know best, doctor knows best, do as you're told. So something about the idea of respect. What I'm beginning to think of as the 3 R's of behaviour change. The respect, responsibility, and the one that intrigues me most at the moment because of the absurdity of the world and reflected in the title of our book is the idea of rebellion. And I'm grateful at this point for a colleague in Granada. The president talked about internationalism, and surely that is true. It gives us wonderful insights. And a colleague at the University of Granada, Juan Miguel Pino, who introduced me to a piece of work written by a liberation theologist. Introduced it to me because it's in Spanish, so he translated it for me. And it's a wonderful sort of step forward from that old adage, it's not about giving them a fish. It's not even about teaching them to fish. It's about recognizing their ownership of the river. And that idea that we all have a dog in this fight, I think, is really, really important. It leads us to wonderfully powerful and positive things like empowerment and human rights and the idea of our human potential, that given the chance, we can do wonderful things. Given the chance, we can get to the moon. But at the same time, it brings in a slightly more grown-up concept as well, that we have to take responsibility for our actions. We have to recognize that if we shop at Tesco's, there's a cost to pay for that. There's a price to pay for that. We have to start to wrestle with difficult things like culpability and obligations. So it makes life a little bit more difficult. And I think it's that idea of growing up, if you will, that leads me to this notion that we need to rebel, we need to challenge, we need to criticize, but we need to do that with some progressive insight, some sense of moving forward, thinking clearly about where we want to go. We want to go. When all's said and done, we all, at the moment, live in democracies. That means we have rights, but we have responsibilities. And I'm going to argue today that one of our responsibilities is, when things are going wrong, to rebel. Divided what I'm going to say into, how many? Five areas. I want to start by talking about the system in which we live, and surely that is flawed, and rehearse some of them. We've touched on them already today, so I'll go through them quite quickly. I don't think there's much argument about them. I then want to go to a slightly more difficult one, which we don't tend to focus on a lot. That said, we are all part of this system. And it's a system that is built famously, thanks to marketing, around our every want, every need, every whim, every foible. So we are very much implicated in what is going on. I want to pick up on the idea that, however, it need not be so. This is a system that has pushed us in a certain direction. We can push back, and we can look inside ourselves to what we are capable of, and we can begin to do things differently. And that we can then generalize, we can collectivize that thinking, and indeed have done as a species with the move towards human rights and the United Nations. But then we still have to go back to the fact that we have to work in a very flawed system. So let's just look at that system a little bit more, first of all. This immense inequalities is no longer in debate. This is an Oxfam report just from earlier this year. A massive, massive concentration of wealth in very few hands. And we know, we in public health in particular know, that this has a massive impact on people's well-being, people's health. Inequalities are really, really bad for us. We think about the sort of job economy. Again, not just as a grandfather, but as a parent, I think of the sorts of rights that are being stripped away from my children that I took for granted. The pension rights, for example. And we're moving towards this very much more insecure area where wealth for the few is being built on the insecurity of the many. In my own country, these pictures are from Scotland rather than Britain, Scotland. Food banks. What are we doing with food banks in the biggest world economy? It's an insanity, an obscenity. Industrial epidemics, of course, the core work of many of us in this room. And this is Margaret Chan talking about big food, big soda, big alcohol, big tobacco, and the impact they have. We know about the commercial determinants of ill health and the need to do something about them. We've done the evidence. You know, we know that the tobacco marketing recruits the young people. We know that the alcohol marketing does the same. We know that the fast food marketing is making us all fat as fast as we can go. And this starts terribly, terribly young. It's now clear that the marketing of infant formula, for example, breast milk substitutes, it has a massive impact. Think for a moment of breast milk substitutes and think for a moment of breast milk, the natural way of feeding a baby. It's better for the baby's health, better for the baby's IQ. It's better for the mother's health. It's quintessentially sustainable. There are no factories, there's no production lines, there's no packaging. It's the most wonderful product you could possibly have. Yet, Globally, and it doesn't change much between countries, it has only 37% market share. That's shocking. And this power, this influence over our behaviors is only going to grow, is growing with the digital environment, which is becoming increasingly troubling. 360 degrees, 24/7, marketing is going on all the time. The concentration of our thoughts by feeding back to us what we said in the first place. Thankfully, Ireland is beginning to push back against this, and I think this might well turn into another smoke-free success for Ireland. I think other countries are beginning very concerned about it at all, and there will be international action. But at the moment, there isn't. And I well remember working on the Echo group for the effort on childhood obesity by the WHO, talking to an epigeneticist. Not a word I can say, let alone understand. But they understand about how our bodies work. And he was saying that if you take a child from conception through and look at the diet they're having, particularly if their mother is eating sugary, fatty, salty foods in pregnancy, and then that carries on through childhood. He said by the age of 10, it's game over. That child's future is determined. These are terrifying realities that we have to respond to. And that isn't drilling down to the public health area that we're comfortable with. If you think beyond that, the hazards of a system where we can have whatever we want, whenever we want it, as often as we want it, provided we've got the brass, the money to pay for it. This is not a journey that's going to end happily, is it? We will tell our children countless times that you can't always have what you want. And yet we have a system that ensures adults get exactly that, if they've got the money. And of course, climate change itself. It's a system where we satisfy our wants by just consuming more and more is ultimately going to lead to disaster. We know this in our water. We are beginning to do things about it, but they are baby steps. And what we are not yet grasping, as far as I can see, is the idea that consumption has to go down. That is almost sacrilege to say that. We have to, economic growth, perpetual economic growth, is just not possible. So the system is shite, really. The system is really, really crap. And it is great to get up and get angry and furious about that and so on. The big but, the elephant in the room, of course, is that we are part of that system. Ours is a consumer society built around our every need. Marketing is defined as making what you can sell, not selling what you can make. They only do this stuff because we buy it. Endless market research is done to ensure that our every want is catered for. The customer is king. Consumer orientation, consumer satisfaction, excellent customer service, all these things have become words that we use naturally. When I first began my career, my first job was in market research. At that point in history, we were instructed, I was going to say advised, instructed when we were constructing a questionnaire not to use the word brand, because it was a technical term that the general public would not understand. I was in a school last week, primary school, talking to kids about this stuff, and they were using the word brand quite freely and readily. 8-year-olds understand brand now. That's how inculcated this market system has become in our lives. We are pampered and indulged at every turn. And we collaborate with devout enthusiasm. We don't do this reluctantly. They don't drag us screaming to the supermarket, say, oh no, not another shopping trip. They don't force us to eat a burger or pour Coca-Cola down our throats. We do it with enthusiasm. Loyalty cards give us away. This is UK data, but Tesco Club Card, 16 million members. 60 million people have signed up for this. Its rival Sainsbury's has over 19 million. And just in case the Irish folk here are feeling a bit smug, Ireland is equally into this. On average, they have 4 loyalty cards in their pocket. Bearing in mind that the dictionary definition of loyalty is a feeling of devotion, duty, or attachment to somebody, it's very, very sad that we use that to describe our relationship with a multinational corporation that is intent on raping and pillaging us to death. And in case with this, at this moment, anybody's thinking, well, they said a bit victim blaming, where's he going with this? It's these smokers, it's their own bloody fault for smoking. Yeah, that is uncomfortable, and I do feel I would shrink away from that. But let's talk for a moment about smartphones. I won't even ask how many people have got a smartphone in here, because I think just about everybody has. Smartphones depend on a mineral called coltan. It's only found in the Democratic Republic of Congo in West Africa, a country that's a basket case. It's run by warlords and it is in a terrible state. This is Amnesty's report on the mining of coltan. It introduces us to Deku, who is 8. Every day he walks to the Rushy mine. It takes him 2 hours to walk there. He sorts soil from mineral deposits with his bare hands, and his pay buys a day's food. So he's back again tomorrow. The profits go to Apple and the rest of the big tech companies. The phones, of course, go to us. So when Mark Dummett of Amnesty talks about the glamorous marketing that persuades us to buy these things and the contrast between this and the children carrying bags of rocks and miners in narrow man-made tunnels, he's right, and something needs to be done about that. Surely we need to be containing this and stopping this happening. So regulation is a vital part of what's going on here. But so do we need to be catch ourselves on a little bit here. We choose to buy these things. We choose to exploit Deku. Now, I know this, you know this if you care to find out. We prefer to turn the other way. So we are the system. This is the Anthropocene. That means we're causing this shit. That's what it means. This is a source that is about as conservative as you can imagine. It's from the Vatican. 20% of the world's population consumes resources that are at a rate that robs the poor nations and future generations of what they need to survive. We are eating our children's dinner. So the problems of consumer capitalism, and I love to talk about the problems of consumer capitalism, they depend on us, willing consumers. So Seabrook puts this very beautifully. Marketing is the keeper of a dangerous but highly profitable secret. It knows how to promote a sense of universal neediness, to set up a wanting without end, a cult and culture of a desire which must not be thwarted. However, he also gives us a spark of hope. He goes on to point out that this power actually is very fragile because it is dependent upon our voluntary collaboration. All that is needed for it to fail is that people should declare themselves content with what they have already. That's it. That is a very fragile house of cards that even a corporation the size of Coca-Cola has built for itself. So yes, we are collaborating in this system that is clearly not fit for purpose and needs major changes from it. Not our hard-earned money, but our criticism and our demand for change. And what is more, Seabrook is onto something. It need not be so. This is not what human beings were made for. We have both the tools and the capacity to respond to this challenge. The tools we've talked about all day today, and fantastic series of speeches we've had, starting with Walter this morning, learning about social marketing and its potential to move things in the other direction. I absolutely get that. I think that is really important. The only cavil I would have with it all is that we talk about this is something that Philip Kotler sort of invented in 1969, 1970. I don't agree. I think marketing is as old as human civilization. It's about doing deals. It's what humankind has always done. We are a weak species. We are frail and vulnerable when we are on our own. It's only when we operate together, using our very powerful brains to work out that if I look after Alan and Alan looks after Christine, the three of us together will be a lot better off than if we work on our own. So if Alan can hunt, Christine can shoot, and I can cook, we have a dinner. Individually, we starve. And that's really what marketing is about. It's that process of mutually beneficial exchange. Me and you we can work better together. Therefore, I will give you something you want, and you will give something I want, and there the equity is beautifully laid in place. That's how we survived on the African savannas, I would posit. That goes to hell when you start to get the sorts of persuasive power of a company like Diageo or the tobacco industry or Coca-Cola. Suddenly my power as a teenager to resist that sort of approach is that sort of deal is completely vitiated. I am helpless before this onslaught. And that is all the more so when you think of the tech giants and the power they are now wielding in our world. So that marketing balance of power has disappeared. And I would argue, following on from all the talks that we've had today, that our survival depends on us reclaiming it, on criticising what the gaffers of this world are doing and using techniques that are not manipulative but are move us back to mutually beneficial exchange to bring about a better world. So with these tools of critical and social marketing, I would argue we can help Deku, we can do something rather unpleasant to Mr. Zuckerberg, and we can save the polar bear. We also have the capacity to do this, the courage, the decency to do this. This is an editorial from the Guardian of a couple of years ago talking about climate change. And they point out, I think, very powerfully, we are the only species capable of reflecting on our impact. We have moral agency. We can foresee the likely consequences of our actions, consider them, and then make choices. Sadly, they go on to say we're not making them at the moment, but we can. And this is the novelist and poet Ben Okri talking just earlier this year in the same newspaper. A citizen is a living unit of democracy, a living force for the possibilities of the world. That word possibility is really important. Of all the qualities, the one I most value in a citizen is not political savvy or higher education, but awareness. Everything else can be bought or smothered or divided or confused, but awareness asks questions of the world. There are many with excellent education who see the conditions of the world, but then rationalize them. Awareness sees them as they are. Then they ask questions. They ask why. And I think that idea of critical awareness, critical awakening is a vital part of making progress. And I think social marketing has an amazing role to play in encouraging that. And yes, this throws up the time-old question of whether we should be dealing with the individual or the system, which I would suggest to you is a phony question, because these are two sides of the same coin. You cannot do one without the other. As the graffiti, we're in the anniversary of the 1968 uprising in France, not just students but workers as well. One of the graffiti that was most quoted, to call in question the society you live in, you must first be capable of calling yourself in question. The two are irreversibly connected. You cannot do one without the other. And I think we need to park that one and recognize it. And that the best way we can bring about social change, such as the regulation of marketing, for example, is for citizens to demand this of their leaders. We live in a democracy. That's how it's supposed to work. Starting to take that sort of responsibility gets us into some very deep water. This is back to the same report from the Vatican about climate change. When we ask ourselves what kind of world we want to leave behind, we think in the first place of its general direction, its meaning and its values. If those issues are courageously faced, we are led inexorably to ask other pointed questions. What is the purpose of our life in this world? Why are we here? What is the goal of our work and all our efforts? What need does the earth have of us? Which is a wonderful echo there of Kennedy's talk about his country and ask not what your country can do for you, etc. But a question that I think we very seldom ask, and I think since the Industrial Revolution, we've barely ever asked it in the industrialized countries. We ask can we get out the earth, but we very rarely ask what we can do for the earth. I love that transposition. So it takes us into very deep philosophical water. We have to start to think about what sort of creatures we are. You know, what is it to be a human being? What is it to be a man or a woman? What is it to be an adult? What is it to be a citizen? of the world. I warned you it's deep water. The writer who for me has explained this as far as it can be explained in a way that I find helpful anyway is Primo Levi, the Auschwitz survivor who wrote this book shortly after coming out of the camps in 1946. And he makes the point, uncomfortable though it is, that the Nazi Holocaust did one thing that has never been done before, hopefully will never be done since, but it was a very powerful experiment to try and show what it is to be a human being. And he points out that in the camps they were deliberately degraded. The intention was to make them subhuman, thereby make it easier to kill them. And he says, we are slaves, deprived of every right, exposed to every insult, condemned to certain death. But we still possess one power, and we must defend it with all our strength, for it is the last. The power to refuse our consent. Now, Levi's talking about that in a situation which is the most appallingly disempowered situation you could possibly imagine. Yet he still argues that not only can we do this, but to do this is what makes us human. If we don't do it, then we are resigning from the human race. And he uses as his backup for his argument the work of Dante, the Italian poet, going back many years now, and Dante himself is referring back to the ancient Greeks. And the quote from Dante that he focuses in on, which I think is a marvelous one: "Look inward to your origins. For brutish ignorance your metal was not made. You were made human, to follow after wisdom and virtue." To follow after wisdom and virtue. What is more, what he's saying is that this is what makes us human beings. So the idea that we don't engage people in the process of change, that we don't educate and get people critically aware so that they can respond to it, that is a really problematic idea, that we ignore what Levi is saying is essentially their humanity. What is more, it does very quickly take us beyond the individual. And this paragraph is a quiet reference to the founder of the British Health Service, Nye Bevan, who was of mining stock in South Wales and actually nursed his father to death from pneumoconiosis. And one of the reasons Bevan was so determined to introduce a free health service was because of that experience. But it's going through those sorts of experiences that very rapidly enable us to empathize with other coal miners. So his father had died, his father's mates were dying of the same thing. Just as if a car knocks me off my bike, the benefits of cycle paths suddenly become much more apparent, not just for me, but for everyone, for my children, for my grandchildren, and for my neighbors and friends. So we very quickly move to a place where we're not just thinking of ourselves, but we're thinking more collectively, more systemically. And Albert Camus thought very much along these lines when he talked about the idea of us rebelling against the absurdity of life. But in doing that, in rebelling against it, we immediately connect with our fellow human beings. So we had previously, I think, therefore I am. He's saying, I rebel, therefore we are. It's a wonderful step from the individual to the collective. Really, I think, reinforcing that graffiti from the Parisian streets. This takes us very, very firmly to the area of human rights, because Camus and Levi were writing, of course, at the end of the Second World War, and the horrors that had gone on there led very directly to the idea that people had rights, that human beings have some fundamental qualities like inherent dignity and members of the human family. And the view developed these had to be protected, and because of the horrors, never again was the motif. And that led to the Declaration of Human Rights. That's why those exist, because people wanted to enshrine those. Interestingly as well is that inherent dignity and the equal members of the human family are important protections. But what is also very clearly in that legislation and in developments of it since is the idea of human potential. Human rights are less about the way people are than about the way they might become, than what they might become. And this really talks about the idea that it's not just enough to, stop kids being attacked by strangers. You've also got to think about, well, what kids are going to, if you're too heavy-handed about that, they stop playing out, and that has repercussions. So really, all that human rights protections do is open up a space where people can talk about fulfilling their potential. And that brings us straight to the principle of participation, which I think we can see again as a human right, that we have a right not just to a better world, but we have a right to be involved in the journey towards that better world. So really the idea of, of nudging people into better behavior starts to look pretty sordid at this point, because we should be giving people the potential to fulfill their potential. So this is a UN document talking about those participatory principles, the idea of empowering people, seeing people as stakeholders, communities to be empowered to control the way money set aside for them is spent. So it's not about, the white saviour coming in and helping them. Very much in Cadina's words, about recognising their ownership of the river. And this, I think we can see examples of this through history that really take us back. I'm assuming everybody in the room knows this woman, the woman who famously started a movement against the segregation of buses in the southern United States. And I came across this quote just recently from a woman like Rosa Parks, but a young woman now, so much, much younger, obviously. And she's saying, if you believe it's only amazing people who are doing great things, you don't realize you can do it too. The reason people teach the great man theory is that it immobilizes you. Then they've got you. It's this co-creation, this idea that we can do things together to make the world better that makes us human beings. Okay. The sun is still shining, we need to get out. But the system is still flawed. So let me just draw a couple of conclusions. And the final thing I want to do is just to explain the image on the front of the book. Because the explanation that Christian and I carefully put into the book was missed out in the printing process accidentally. But the system is still flawed. We need to listen to Ben Okri. We have to pay attention. We have to be aware and alert to what is happening. We have to think critically about it. And I think a great job for social marketers and critical marketers is to provide some help in that process, to help people to open their eyes and to think about what is happening. It's a key task to empower people to think and act critically in what is an increasingly troubled world. Individually, we have moral agency. I think that's beyond dispute. Collectively, we have the strength. And that takes us to the picture. The picture is, sorry, at this point, I'm going to ask you to stand up. I want you to stand up if you would. And I'd like you to just put your hands in the air like that. It's like you're pushing something away. We've lost our picture, is there? Oh, well, we don't need it. You're pushing that, and this is a symbol of rebellion. The picture that I showed you, just keep your hands like that if you would. The picture that I showed you is by Picasso, and it depicts something called the Sardane. And the Sardane is a circle dance that's done in Catalonia, Spanish and French Catalonia. And it's called the Sardane de la Paix, the Sardane of peace, because he's put a piece of dove above it. And this action here symbolizes the protests that have gone on down the centuries from, against Napoleon right through to the battle against Franco and then Hitler, saying no, 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 not in my name, this is not going to happen. Now, at this stage, how are your arms feeling? Okay, what I would like you to do is just hold hands with the person on your left or right. Keep your hands up, but hold hands. Okay, how does that feel? Much better. And that is the point of the Sardane, that together, individually we can protest, but we get tired and it's difficult. Together, we can sustain that protest. So individual moral agency can combine to make a difference in the world. Thank you for listening.